Okay, so I wanted to just get this information out of the way during asynchronous because it's relatively quick and pretty straightforward. It should be about 10 to 12 minutes, I would think. And let me actually start my timer. So we just finished talking about the different theories of intelligence. Now we got to talk about, all right, how do we assess intelligence? And how has intelligence testing changed over the years? This idea of assessing intelligence was not really around until the early 1900s, but since then, there's have been multiple different phases and what is considered to be a valid test of intelligence and what is not. The original, oh, sorry. So there are two types of tests that we can have in terms of intelligence tests. There are what are called aptitude tests. Aptitude tests are tests that are meant to measure or predict how well you will do in the future on a new skill. But for instance, the SAT, Scholastic Aptitude Test, its goal is to measure how well you are going to do in college. The NFL Combine is an aptitude test to try to measure how well they predict somebody will do in the NFL. Okay, so any of those, the ASVAB is one that I'm not sure if it's still around, but it was when I was younger, and that was meant to predict how well you would do in the military. So aptitude tests are trying to assess and predict your ability to learn a new skill. Achievement tests are tests that measure what you have already learned, like the AP Psych exam or any of the unit tests that we have in here. Really, any test, unless it's a pre-test in a class, pretty much any test in school is a test of achievement. So we have aptitude tests, which predict how well you're going to do with a new skill, and achievement tests, which show how well you have learned something. Intelligence testing started really in the early 1900s with two French guys named Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon. Um, in so up until the early 1900s, basically what happened with kids that were not up to on the cognitive level of their peers, they were basically taken out of school and just sent to work. Um, and a lot of times there wasn't really any metric for how they put kids into certain classes. A lot of times they group them by socioeconomic status. So no matter how smart or whatnot you were, if you were rich, you would go into some classes, and if you were not, you would go into others. In the early 1900s, France made it illegal for children to work before like the age of 13. So what this ended up with were a lot of kids that were in school that they didn't necessarily know what to do with, who were performing below their age. And so what they had Binet and Simon, and also a guy that you've heard of named Jean Piaget, do is try to design tests to predict school achievement. Right? What sorts of classes should students be placed in so that it wasn't just random? What they came up with here was assessing what is called mental age, which is looking at the cognitive ability of somebody of a certain age. Okay, the typical cognitive ability of a child of a certain age. So if a 10-year-old does as well as an average 10-year-old, their mental age is 10. Okay, if they are performing on the level of a 13-year-old, their physical age is 10, but their mental age is 13. They did this by designing a test that had 30 tasks of increasing difficulty, which the easiest would be one that everybody could do. And then they got progressively and progressively harder. So if a 9-year-old is going further than the rest of their peers, they would be considered above average and would be considered to have a higher mental age. And as we said, a lot of what they did, Piaget worked with them later on, but a lot of their research is what influenced Piaget as well. So from that, and this test, the Binet and Simon were doing it for the good of people. Okay, they were doing it to help out children that may have been struggling. They wanted to see how extra help in school can raise somebody's mental age, and going against the idea that intelligence is entirely inherited and there's nothing that we can do about that. In the mid 1900s, though, in the United States, comes a guy named Lewis Terman. Terman believed that intelligence was entirely innate, meaning we are born with a certain level of intelligence, and that there's really nothing that we can do about that. And from this comes a test, which is the first modern IQ test. IQ stands for intelligence quotient. First modern IQ test, what is called the Stanford Binet. They named it after Alfred Binet, um, and it was said to reveal the intelligence with which one was born. Unfortunately, Binet would not have liked this test at all for certain reasons that we'll get into here in a sec. But Terman actually came up with what was used for a long time. It's not used anymore, but the equation to determine what somebody's IQ was. And this equation is mental age, which is calculated by the test, divided by chronological age times 100. So if you have somebody that has a mental age of 13 and they are 9 years old, you would go 13 divided by 9 equals 1.44 times 100. Right, so their IQ would be 144, which would be, according to the Stanford Binet, which would be in the genius level. Unfortunately, what what Terman wanted to do was essentially try to weed out people for what he called feeble-mindedness. Terman was interested in what's called eugenics, which is where you sort of select traits out of a population. Is what the Nazis did a lot of. But essentially, what he wanted to do was identify people who were considered unintelligent and stop them from reproducing. Okay, and just so their what he considered to be inferior genes would not be passed on. Okay, if you need to do more work, understand this better. I have 3 different equations right here. Okay, if an 8-year-old has a mental age of 10, what is their IQ? A 12-year-old has a mental age of 9, what is his IQ? And then a boy has a mental age of 10 and an IQ of 200. How old is he? You do need to know what this equation is. mental age divided by chronological age times 100 was the original equation that was used to identify IQ using the Stanford Binet test. Finally, in the 60s, I think, comes a guy named David Wechsler, who he does not believe in this idea of innate intelligence, but he does believe that there is some truth to this idea of IQ. What Wechsler wanted to look at is what is called testing strengths. Similar to what we talked about with the multiple intelligences with Howard Gardner, or the triarchic theory of intelligence with Sternberg, Wechsler believed that intelligence was not, he believed in the overall idea of IQ, but he also believed that people had specific competencies and that he wanted to design a test that would be able to isolate, using factor analysis, isolate these specific testing strengths. What comes out of this is what is the modern IQ test. So if you have ever taken an IQ test, and some of you have, and you know there are different tests on it, some of them, a lot of it is pattern based and whatnot. Um, these IQ tests measure overall intelligence, IQ. Okay, they measured verbal comprehension, they measured perceptual organization, and working memory. So they still gave you that number that we go off of now. The average IQ is 100, and we'll talk about that more later. But they also identified these different subsets. So if you've ever had to get a test from school, like if you were ever assessed for a learning disability or anything like that, chances are you took one of these tests that was designed by David Wechsler. All right. There are three of them. There's what is called the WAIS, which is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. There is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And then there is the WPPSI, which is the Wechsler Pre and Primary Scale of Intelligence. And really what you need to remember about this is not only does it assess overall IQ, but particularly the ones that he's looking at are performance and verbal abilities. So those are the three different, that's sort of the timeline of the development of the IQ test. You have Simon and Binet figuring out how to predict achievement level so the children could be placed in the correct classes. You have Terman, who developed the equation for IQ for less than less than nice reasons to try to identify people who were not smart. And then Wechsler, so that students could be identified and be given any sort of extra help that they might need, or even adults given any sort of extra help that they might need. So those are the three. And as I said, I would be about, all right, a little bit under 14 minutes. So there you go.